Welcome back to the Converge podcast, where we try to help you have a Christian worldview in a non-Christian culture. My name is Steve.
My name is Nate.
And we are pastors at Village Church. Well, again, welcome back to the Converge podcast. And today, Nate specifically had something that the Lord put on his heart and impressed on his soul.
Absolutely.
And he was very emotional about it. And he wanted to talk about a pressing, personal heartbeat of an issue.
I just had to get this out, or I couldn't contain it. So now, for this episode, we're going to have a little bit of a more lighthearted episode, but at the same time, it's a serious topic. But we just wanted to throw something out there we could talk about a little bit of some things we see happening in the church that we think will be fun to talk about. And so the title of this episode is Your Youth Pastor and Your Parents Were Right All Along. And here's where we're going with this. We have noticed kind of a cliche the last 5 years or so in evangelical culture of people our age, and our age I'm going to be pretty broad with, 30s and 40s. Okay, people who grew up in the church in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s even, who are very critical of their upbringing and kind of present the attitude that just everything was done wrong in how they grew up in the church, and their youth group was lame and their parents were lame, and kind of all the way that the church was presented and Christianity was presented to them was lame. And we want to push back against that a little bit and kind of talk about actually a lot of things that your parents said and your youth pastor said they were pretty right on about.
I would be considered a youth group kid. Yeah. Would you be considered a youth group kid?
Yeah, sure. Yep.
Yeah. I went to youth group. I've said many times before, I've been in church basically my entire life, Sunday school, children's church, youth ministry. And sometimes I do wonder why I have such a different perspective as to my upbringing and my experience. I even went to a Christian school, and I have a positive memory. I had a positive experience in everything that I did. I even hold to different doctrinal beliefs than I was taught in many ways.
Sure, yep.
As a child. Not necessarily on what we would call primary issues, but definitely a lot of secondary issues and a lot of stuff that feeds into primary issues for me. I definitely have different views on now. Yet I have a great look. And the interesting thing is when you hear a lot of, quote unquote, deconversion stories, reasons that somebody walked away from the faith, they really will try to paint around it as though it is this great intellectual, academic treatise of a reason as to why they're walking away from the faith. But almost in unison, they all typically boil down to my church was lame, my youth group was lame, my parents were lame, my Christian school was lame, and it's less about any concrete doctrinal issue, even though they would deny all of the true doctrines of Scripture. Instead, they look back and they just kind of talk about how lame everyone was.
It's like it starts with an emotion. It starts with, I'm now out in the world and I'm realizing these things that I was taught are uncool and unaccepted in culture. And so that deconversion ends up with rejecting the doctrines behind those things. And so we want to kind of step back and say, look, sure, there were some things that were weird. Sure, some things weren't done in the best way. But by and large, the basis behind those things, the theology, the doctrine, and even, and this is where people are going to disagree, but they need to not, the culture.
Yeah.
The view into culture was by and large correct. Were there some weird things? Sure. And here's what happens. People assume their own bad experience was normative. People do that all the time. So what we are not saying is that something weird did happen in your family and in your church. We're not denying that. And we're not saying
if you were in a independent Baptist cult, because they did exist.
Yeah, of course.
I was raised in the independent Baptist church, but if you were in one of the far-reaching, extreme independent Baptist cults. If you experienced any type of abuse, because that did happen, but that's not a denominational thing. That happened across denominations because, until security protocols were put in place by everyone much later, every denomination has horror stories.
In every secular institution.
All right, yeah.
Look at the Boy Scouts. Look at public school.
Across culture and across society, there was a time when nutcases and perverts were just able to hide and blend in, and it's just more difficult for them to do that.
So that's not what we're talking about at all right now. There were silly things that happened in evangelical subculture. We made Christian versions of everything.
McGee and Me, I've gone back and watched. It was like a half human, half cartoon show. Yeah. And I've watched it now. I thought it was the best thing when I was like 10, and they're pretty lame.
Yeah.
They're pretty lame.
Yeah.
Some of the movies that I watched a lot of Christian movies at my church. I, for nostalgia reasons, own all the VHSs of the Image of the Beast series. It was a 4-part series that began with the film Thief in the Night, and I wish we'd all been ready. That song came out of there. DC Talk made it famous, I guess, later. But it somehow ended by the 4th volume with zombies in the tribulation period.
That's when it got good, though.
So that one, it didn't start well and it didn't end well. So that was pretty cheesy.
Yeah, I mean, you had bad Christian music. Look, that happened. That continues to happen.
Yeah,
bad Christian movies are getting worse.
There was an era where especially in
sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
Did you know there is currently a Christian movie called Small Group?
No. Oh wait, no, you told me about this. Yeah.
Like the life of
But more than that, it's about somebody that goes undercover to write an article about a small group. And I'm sure some of you are going to watch that and think it's the best thing ever, but you're wrong.
Do not bring that to us. We're telling you right now.
I don't want to see it.
Here.
I don't want to see it at all. But there were also some really great things that some people look back at and they say, "Oh, this was terrible." Game time was awesome. We played crazy games that you were only ever going to play in church. Big ball volleyball, where this ball, I don't even know where they got it. It was the size of like 4 people. And we would get on a volleyball court and we would play volleyball with it. We had college groups come in and we would have war games every year. And we would play tug of war over a real mud pit. And people really had to go to the emergency room because of what happened during that tug of war. And some of that, I had a great time.
Yeah.
I had the time of my life.
Or else you get to play capture the flag like that.
Right. It was a lot of fun.
Here's another thing. When did pizza parties become a bad thing?
I don't know the connection that a lot of people, I hear this all the time, where people blame pizza parties for apostasy.
I still love pizza parties.
I have pizza parties in my house probably once a week, and my kids, they love it. But now I have this fear that because I get my kids pizza, they're going to be apostate later in life. And I say that tongue-in-cheek, but people really do try to make this connection between youth groups giving kids food that they actually want to eat, and then 10 years later, they're not in the church anymore. And I think we give all these silly examples, but I think that's actually what we want to talk about. We want to expose the fallacy.
Because here's what I will say in relation to the pizza parties. One thing that did happen in this, but we're going to get into this. I don't really think this was anyone's fault. There was an underlying, in some places, anti-intellectualism, or we're afraid to talk about kind of the deeper issues behind some of the cultural issues, and that shouldn't happen.
Yeah,
and we're correcting that to some extent. However, just because people of a generation, and let's just get back to our topic, our youth pastor and our parents, just because they didn't know how to address some of the foundational underlying theological topics doesn't mean that they were wrong to try to bring up some of these broader issues. They weren't. And we need to respect that and honor that. And so we're going to go through a few things that it turns out they're actually very right about.
Oh, yeah.
And the first and foremost thing, and this is kind of what brought this topic up, what sent us down this rabbit hole, was if you were anything like me, I heard in church all the time about the dangers of relative truth and how it was so important to be grounded in absolute truth. Just that message was just continually reinforced. And you know what?
What's fascinating to me is that they will look at youth groups and talk about, it was unintellectual. There was anti-intellectualism coming on. But then at the same time, they will also look back at it and talk about how foolish it was that youth pastors, even the parents that were actually involved, which we'll talk about too, the parents that were involved in ministry were spending a lot of time, especially I think around the mid '90s is when that talk started happening. When these warnings came from curriculum that was being used from youth pastors that were keeping kind of their ear to the ground about relative truth and about the rejection of absolute truth. And academics, as well as even people that are walking away from the faith, look back at that and talk about how foolish those people were. They didn't know what they were talking about.
They were right on.
Yeah, and they were right.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And so talk about that a little bit. Why were they right? How, in what ways were they very right?
If you want to sum it down, it was a warning about relative truth and absolute truth, and saying that there was coming into not just education, but in pop culture, this way of looking at absolutes. Like if you say something is right and something is wrong, that is an absolute statement. If you say something is true or something is false, that is an absolute statement. And they were warning us that there was coming into society this movement to relativize truth and to blur the lines and to create, and this is something that I experienced in college, to create an abundant amount of gray areas where there was no objective truth, rather there is a personal truth. And they were mocked, and years later, I actually took what I learned in youth group and went into academics with it. And so, especially in a current postgraduate program that I'm in right now, I'm specifically studying postmodernism. I'm studying what postmodernism calls meta-narrative, or basically, Jean-Francois Lyotard was a French philosopher, and he was requested to write a treatise for the nation, for Quebec, as to a report on what knowledge was going to be where society was concerned in the future. And what Lyotard does is he brings into question what he calls legitimation. In other words, how do you know something is true? How do you know? And he looks at it through the lens of science. He kind of takes philosophy and puts it onto science. And he asks the question, how do you know that what emerges from the scientific method is true? How do you know that the proof that is offered is true? And he asks what actually are some really good questions. Who makes the experts experts? Who legitimizes the legitimate? Mm-hmm. So who are the provers of proof? And so he looks at truth and he says, basically in the scientific community, all that we have for truth is a consensus among experts as to what is true. And he says, how do you trust that?
Yeah.
Because there is no real system of giving absolute expertise. And what he does is he uses that to say that much of what is used for legitimation of knowledge is nothing more than a consensus as to the direction that scientists and academics, and he looks specifically at the university, he is used specifically to make the university life more efficient. And he says things aren't necessarily true just because they're efficient. But if we continue down the road and trajectory that we're on, he says that basically knowledge is nothing more than used to wield power over everybody, and societies are built by power. And so that's what he looks at it. But then in the end, he brings what is called the postmodern construct in, and his vision for the future is that knowledge can't be legitimated. Everything that was ever looked at as reasonable in the modern era must be deconstructed and not reconstructed, because legitimation is an impossible goal. He calls it paralogy. Yeah. He says basically the only way that we're ever going to come to any real knowledge is if we accept that we must destroy every amount of what we think knowledge is, and then seek to accept that everyone is going to have a personal experience of truth.
So those warnings about relative truth, I mean, perhaps they were oversimplified, but I don't even think that's fair, because I think it was just giving what they knew about the culture at the time.
Well, I think a lot of people, and here's where anti-intellectualism actually exists outside of the walls of the church.
Yeah.
People don't know what two words mean. Number one, they didn't know what relative means. Yeah. And secondly, they didn't know what truth meant. Truth is not initially an attack on the gospel. Truth is initially an attack on knowledge, but it asks an epistemological question. It asks, how do you know what is true? But that inevitably is going to bleed over into every form of philosophy where the postmodern construct invades everything, which necessarily has to invade the church, which makes us look at it and say, how do we know that the gospel is true? Because science is supposed to be detached from any narrative of trying to get somewhere. Mm-hmm. And what Leotard said is that a meta-narrative is actually what everything is based on. It's the story that science is trying to build, and that's what society becomes. Yeah. And so the gospel then has to be questioned, because what does a biblical worldview build? It builds an ethos. It builds a culture. It builds a people who have a specific way of living, a specific language they converse with each other about, and specific ways in which they say are right and wrong. And so for the postmodernist, they would look at Christianity and say, this is probably the grandest meta-narrative that exists, is the reason behind what we call the Christian faith.
Yeah. So right now, we're absolutely seeing this play out. We're seeing relative truth and postmodernism sweep through the culture. And there's even been, and I want to talk about this a little bit, there's been a push to say, see, postmodernism didn't happen because look at wokeness and look at how legalistic they are. Like, they have a clear moral standard that they're trying to enforce. That's not relative truth. That's not postmodernism. I'll say
it is
absolutely
100% postmodernism.
Because it is, the legitimacy of that is based purely on what is most popular at the time and what we can enforce through power. There's no root truth.
So when people hear about pluralism, that was kind of the scary word.
Yeah.
When people hear about pluralism, when people hear about relative definitions of truth, they do one of two things. They either ignore it as something that hasn't impacted them, or they think it's not a big deal. But the key is that the way in which societal change, the way in which cultures change, is it doesn't show up at your front door and say, now you are postmodern.
Right.
But instead, it just little by little, inch by inch. And so right now, what you're seeing with, and especially the way social media plays into the way culture changes right now, you are seeing postmodernism invade absolutely everything around you, because you have to understand, what is the goal of postmodernism? It is not reconstruction. It is a continuous drive towards deconstruction of civilized society in order to rebuild it under a different, more abstract reality. And so a postmodern construct seeks no goal of reconstruction. And so I saw on Twitter a week or so ago, there was a professor at Southeastern that mocked someone because they said that part of Derrida's postmodern construct was a deconstruction. She said, no, he was a post-structuralist. Well, what do you think a post-structuralist is? After structure. So there are no structures. So that's the same thing as a deconstructionist. And so a lot of what you see come out of academia is nothing more than a language game that reinforces the postmodern construct. And the biggest way that you can see postmodernism in the woke movement is intersectionality. Mm-hmm. Intersectionality is completely just what postmodernism does. It's a fruit of it. It seeks to create unabsolute identities. But then here's where postmodernism, it can't do what it wants to do. It creates a hierarchy of unabsolute absolutes. And so when you see the hierarchy of experience, it's actually looking at what postmodernism would destroy and saying your personal truth, because you are a minority, because you have a different sexual ethic, because you are a gender that's not male, or you identify as a gender that's not male, on and on and on. What intersectionality does is it deconstructs existence and then labels all of the deconstruction and says, well, since you are of a more deconstructed identity, your experience claims subvert any absolute that someone from the old system, which would be a straight white male, that's the ultimate modern man, you are superior to that person, and here's the deal, because you're postmodern. Now, that's also where postmodernism fails, because postmodernism inevitably becomes the very thing that it says shouldn't exist. It becomes tyranny. It becomes a hierarchical form of having a greater knowledge of truth than someone that hasn't experienced all the truths that you do. And so postmodernism can't do what it wants to do. Everything ultimately becomes a legitimated form of knowledge. Yeah. But what you're actually seeing is the ideals of postmodernism are just to destroy society. Yeah. That is what postmodernism ultimately wants to do. And so when your kids are looking at all these different identities. I turned my television on and it just happened to be on Nickelodeon. And this was probably at 7 o'clock at night. And there was a commercial literally defining for children what microaggressions are. Okay? That is postmodernism. Yep. Because it is creating a life in which personal truths are looked at rather than absolute truths. So in the world of microaggressions, it doesn't matter even if the person or the individual who feels that someone is committing a microaggression against them. A police officer pulling you over, that can be a microaggression. Not just saying something and flippantly because you don't know a struggle a person is having. That can be a microaggression. But what happens is it doesn't matter what is immoral or moral. What matters is how that person feels about their personal experience. And so what you're seeing now is that cultural elites are actually wielding their power, and here we go back to the efficiency construct of Leotard. Yeah. They're wielding their modernistic power in order to inform the masses that there is no such thing as absolute truth. There is only personal truth, and this person's personal truth can be greater than your personal truth, even if what you believe is grounded in reason.
Yes. So all this is to say, when you reject absolute truth, and it was important to explain this because I think we won't spend that much time on the rest, but that makes our point that we're trying to make. Right. When you reject absolute truth and you relativize truth, and now we each legitimize truth for ourselves, and it's how it makes us feel, and that is the essence of how the woke movement has got where it's got. Our youth pastors and parents were right. That's where the world was headed, and we're seeing it now.
What is so sad to me is watching what would be people that are considered faithful Christians, because of their desire to appeal to a generation, they submit to a postmodern worldview while denying the validity of postmodernism. Yeah. They submit to the ideals, and I think some of it's because they're not connecting the dots, and I think some of it is also because they understand that they can wield more power. And that's where Leotard was right. Yeah. Postmodernism has become an efficient tool to make moves in a language game against what they would look at as ham-fisted cornpones, and that's Bible-believing Christians. Yeah, yeah. And that's what's sad. That's what's sad to me. But understand that the consequence of postmodernism, it's always going to be the demon of tyranny, every single time. Because when you seek to deconstruct something, you inevitably are going to have to kill or just destroy certain segments of society that you deem to be under the wrong construct. You have to destroy, and what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to destroy biblical Christianity, because biblical Christianity is inevitably a belief system that claims to have absolute truth. Yep. But the fact is, only the Christian worldview can withstand postmodernism. Yeah. Much of what Leotard is right about are the issues that popped up because of the rejection of Christianity under modernism. And so a lot of Leotard's critique on society was right, because society attempted under modernism to construct a power structure in which humans ruled the world apart from God. And so what Leotard comes in and he says, well, who ordained you as the ruler? Who ordained you as the expert? Who ordained you as the person that could say something is true or something is right just simply based on the fact that it is measurable? And so what happens is when you look at postmodernism under a biblical worldview, Then, and some philosophers and some theologians have done this, they've looked at postmodernism and they've said, well, Christianity doesn't fit Lyotard's definition of meta-narrative. Because even though Christianity it's the grandest narrative that has ever existed, it actually finds legitimation outside of humanity because it is based on the Creator God entering into humanity, revealing himself through revelation, and then coming and actually living a personal truth, and God's truth is the ultimate personal truth, among people. The problem with people like Michael Horton, James K.A. Smith saying that Christianity doesn't fit meta-narrative, you have to then look at it from an atheistic perspective and say, well, according to the atheists, it's definitely going to fit a meta-narrative because they believe human beings created it. Yep. And they believe that the proof system that is built on the Bible is a meta-narrative. It is something that human beings can't legitimate, therefore it's not to be trusted. But this is where Christianity is the most powerful worldview that has ever and will ever exist. Because not only can Christianity combat modernism, because it can, Christianity is rooted in reason. Christianity is rooted in rationality. God doesn't do the irrational. God is a completely rational being. And all of the tenets of modernism that just misunderstand the reality of God, they reject the miraculous because it's immeasurable. But what they don't understand is that that's because God is the authority over that which is immeasurable. Yep. But when you come into postmodernism, you can also combat postmodernism because you can explain to them why, number one, Christianity doesn't fit the human definition of meta-narrative, but number two, Christianity is legitimated by the God who created everything that is. And so Christianity is an absolute truth that can disprove the absence of absolute truth through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And a biblical worldview necessarily must, and I have to be very clear about this, it must lead to the denial of any virtue of postmodernism. This is why intersectionality is, opposed to what some Southern Baptists are saying right now. Intersectionality is not an analytical tool. It's a belief system. It is based in postmodernism. You cannot use an ungodly ideology like intersectionality to understand how to combat false ideology. You can only use your understanding of intersectionality to understand intersectionality. Once you try to use it to find a solution for it, then you espouse the very nature of intersectionality. And so it doesn't fit the definition of an analytical tool. It actually only fits the definition of understanding false doctrine. Mm-hmm. And you understand false doctrine for the purpose of exposing false doctrine, but there is a thread of intellectuals within evangelicalism right now that are actually seeking, because and they simply want to be elite in the way that they understand knowledge because they think they're smarter than pastors. And so they actually want to wield things like intersectionality to have more power and influence. But what they don't understand is that just because something is scholarly or academic, it doesn't mean there's any answers there. When you study intersectionality, you're not going to find answers. You're going to find deconstruction. You're going to find tyranny. And it just doesn't work. I think, yes, James K.A. Smith is right.
Yep. And now a heretic. On top of that. We'll talk about that in a later episode.
Well, if you actually follow James K.A. Smith, who is a professor at is it Covenant College or Calvin College?
Calvin.
At Calvin College. He's a professor at Calvin College. You actually write, and he was one of the prolific guys in denying that Christianity fits the definition of a meta-narrative. And he actually embraced some of the tenets of postmodernism for evangelism. Yep. And what you've actually seen in James K.A. Smith's life is that through embracing those, quote-unquote analytical tools, he has actually left the reservation, and he has embraced some aspects of LGBTQism.
Yep, that's what it led
Which is another postmodern religion.
Right. So something you said, I think, is a good jumping-off point to getting us to the next topic, is postmodernism has to deny God as creator. Mm-hmm. It has to, because if God is creator, then his truth is absolute. And so one thing that I have observed that I'm concerned about is I see more and more people mocking the training and education that we received in regards to evolution and in regards to all the problems of evolution. And once again, they were right on. Yeah. Because when you remove the foundation of God as creator and you bring in Darwinism, which is also a worldview, that necessarily, and you could connect all these dots, but that leads to postmodernism. Every time. And so if you can't accept evolution, but then say, but I'm going to believe in absolute truth, those things don't go together. So the warnings that we have, and couched in a real, like, evolution is evil, evolution comes from a worldview that seeks to deny God. Those kind of talks,
and even theistic evolution is not compatible with Christianity.
Right. And so we want to talk about that a little bit, because I'm seeing more and more of the church kind of, one, being embarrassed because society has progressed, even though it's not progression, in such a way that now it's just assumed.
I'll tell you what I'm
evolution is
about.
True.
I am embarrassed about the faux intellectualism of pastors who simply want to synergize with a certain segment of society because they are afraid of really more cosmopolitan areas and what I would probably look at, and they don't want to be called this, but elitists in certain cosmopolitan areas. They don't want people to think they are those foolish young earth creationists. And so what they do is they submit their intellect to a material system such as evolution, which necessarily does deny God as creator. And it's a faux intellectualism in which, to feel better about themselves compromising on true doctrine, they mock as less than those that would disagree with them. You know, my youth pastor and my Sunday school teachers taught me real biblical doctrine. The earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. God spoke the world into existence, and he did it over a literal 7-day period. And he literally formed a real Adam and a real Adam out of the dust of the ground, and then he formed a real Eve out of Adam's rib. What I just said is biblical Christianity. Anything else becomes less and less biblical. And I think there's conversations to be had.
Sure.
But as soon as you reject the truth of that, you begin a slow march towards theological liberalism. And that's, of course, that would be more of a modern construct, but the tenets of it are not the same. In a world that doesn't want to believe in God, they want to believe everything just happened by chance.
Yeah.
They want to believe that there is a system, even if God was involved. He did it millions of years ago, and everything just kind of formed, and all of it is foolishness. When you look at it through the biblical worldview, you understand that the Spirit testifies just the absolute chaos that would bring into question, and it would also bring into question the validity of absolute truth. And so people that look back at their youth group and they say, how could my youth pastor have taught me, that the earth is young? How could they have taught me that, God created the world in a literal week? Well, they taught you that because that is what the Bible says. The Bible defends that. The Bible cannot be used, and I don't care if I catch heat from this from other pastors. The Bible cannot be used to defend any other view. Everything else is just extra biblical conjecturing, and we don't have the freedom to do that if the Bible is true. And so when someone denies the validity of young earth creationism, what they're actually doing is they're denying the inerrancy of Scripture. They don't want to admit it. They don't want to believe that they're doing that, but they're necessarily doing that. And so your youth pastor was right.
Yeah. And what I see is just folks are saying, and it comes from a reaction of, I don't want to be viewed as dumb in school and in college. My question
is, why do people care so much?
Yeah, well, they do. And so, but the reaction of not wanting to be viewed as dumb is to embrace. This is the first step out, is to embrace theistic evolution.
They're afraid not to get invited to some tea party by somebody.
And this is what we want to say, and I mean, you just said it, but I'm going to repeat it. Theistic evolution is dumb.
Oh, it's terrible.
Because
it
it's the same foundation.
Sense.
It's believing that God kind of initiated things at the start, and then from there, naturalistic processes took root. And if that's true,
it's as dumb as deism.
We don't have anything better than we have from regular evolution.
Right. I have more respect for atheistic evolutionists than I do for theistic evolutionists, because theistic evolution is nothing more than a compromise. It is nothing more than laying down like a spineless coward and just saying, okay, I'll cave.
Yeah, so some key things, and again, we can't spend tons of time on this because we'll go on forever, but you can't lose Adam and Eve.
No.
You cannot lose Adam and Eve and have the gospel.
No, you lose so many key essential doctrines when you begin to lose those things.
Just for folks who don't know, you lose original sin, you lose salvation through Christ, which is, Christ is the better Adam.
Yep.
Jesus clearly believed in Adam and Eve, so you lose something of Jesus's deity if you lose that. There's just so many things down the line. On top of which, you're still saying, and this is where I will defend folks like Ken Ham forever.
Ken Ham is a great help. I'm taking my kids through Answers in Genesis apologetic.
It's really good material. And you are absolutely then saying that something can be created from nothing. And we need to be comfortable saying that the tenets of evolution are foolish and illogical, and we do not see them in the natural order. And
well, the thing is that it is not unintellectual to believe in ex nihilo creation.
Right.
There is matter had to be created ex nihilo. Yeah. William Lane Craig talks about this in the Kamal argument. But there had to be something. There had to be someone, and William Lane Craig does a great job of actually teasing this out to the point where it has to be a personal being who is also God. There had to be someone before there was nothing.
Yeah.
There had to be. And that is the Creator God who created everything that is.
There had to be. So you got a whole philosophical thing there. Here's what I want to say, and then try to move us forward, is you can go online and you can find website after website, even by people who are claiming to be Christians, who are going to give you all this evidence. And this is what happens to people who deconstruct their faith. You can give you all this evidence for this is how we know evolution is true, and they're convinced for all these different reasons. And some of it is just misinterpreting the data. Some of it is not understanding what the claims of creationism are. But I'm just saying they're exhaustive and they're out there. But here's the thing. And there are good answers to all those things that we're not going to get into here. But I believe your youth pastor and your parents were right to tell you that is stupid. And that's just because that is the first defense. Now, do I wish that they had maybe clarified a little bit? It's okay to ask some questions, and you're going to see these people that think they have it all figured out. But the root issue of that is deception. Yeah. It's not that we just have two equal intellectual systems that are opposed to each other. People are deceived.
Yes.
Theistic evolution and natural evolution, which is the same thing, is a deception to remove absolute truth, to remove God as creator. And so, of course, we should expect that they have built up a large system around their deception, but it is good and right that our parents told us that was evil and that was something that we need to be on guard against. And my fear right now is that we're embarrassed by saying that, so we just kind of just don't talk about it. I mean, we do teach creationism at church, but we just don't talk about the evils of evolution. And we're setting a whole generation of kids up to fail even harder than the last one did.
Oh, absolutely. And if you want to boil it down, parents are doing their children an injustice when they don't indoctrinate themselves in these matters.
Yeah.
I was taught growing up what truth was. It is Scripture. And so part of what I have done since I was 15 years old is I have tried to not believe the Bible in many ways. Like I've said, man, this part of my faith doesn't make sense, so I'm going to spend some time studying it. And I've studied, I'm at the postgraduate level now, and I will tell you, my conclusions have always, every single time, come to. Now, there's some issues in the secondary matters where I've altered some views based on the Bible, but when it comes to the foundation of the Christian faith, I have studied the complications and I've studied all of the confusing areas, and I always come back to, okay, my parents were right. Okay, my youth pastor was right. Postmodernism is relative truth. The earth was created by a God who just spoke and it existed. Yeah. And in the truth of the Christian faith is truer than any other truth you are ever going to find. It is an absolute truth, but it's not just, and here's where modernism fails as a philosophy too. It's not just factually true. It is maximal truth. It is everything. And so to look at it is not just to see something that is separated from me and it is a fact I agree with. It is a life that comes upon you in that truth, and it has implications for the way that you live your life, and that's what faith looks like. Christianity is the only truth in existence that creates a faith that impacts everything. And that's what everybody needs to understand about really discipleship from a very young age.
Yeah. All right. We got to move on quick on these topics, but I do want to get through them because I think it's important for what we're talking about. So I don't, a week doesn't go by on Twitter where I don't see someone mocking their upbringing when it comes to purity culture in the church. And I think this is funny because I don't think they know what they're talking about most of the time when they talk about purity culture.
I think most of the people that talk about purity culture weren't raised in... I don't know.
I really wonder.
No one said we're a purity culture. It's not like
right.
we had a handshake.
Well,
here's
what I think happens. Okay. And I see this time and again. Someone was raised in some weird situation. And that we admitted earlier that happens. There was Bill Gothard thing. He was doing arranged marriages and
freaks out
right.
There.
So weird stuff absolutely happens. So someone says this has scarred me, and it probably has, and I'm not delegitimizing that. And so then everyone else looks at that and says, "Yeah, that's purity culture. My youth pastor told me sex before marriage was wrong. I was scarred too." Yeah. It's like
I was
that's
scarred
just Christian
because
orthodoxy.
My youth pastor told me to obey God.
Right.
And it's like, well, if that's your definition of purity culture, then right. I'm totally for it.
Right. And so what happens is we've got folks who just wish that they weren't told the morality of Scripture because they want to do what they want to do. That's not purity culture.
Yeah.
And your youth. So this is we can move on real quickly, but I just want to say your parents.
I don't know if I can.
Your parents and your pastor were right to teach you scriptural morality and sexual ethics.
The important thing to ask when we're talking about purity culture: what is wrong with teaching purity and sexual matters?
Yeah.
Like, that's the question that I want answered. And what that question exposes, when you won't just answer, there is nothing wrong with teaching purity in sexual matters. When you won't just answer that way, you expose that this is actually postmodern deconstructionism all over again, in that you don't want to admit that there is a God-given definition as to what sexuality was meant to be.
And a big part of it is they don't want to admit that obeying God leads to a better life. Because that's a hard truth, but it's true.
Well, and sometimes I think there's a rejection of purity culture because someone either A, had premarital sex, B, investigated an alternative lifestyle, and then afterwards felt shame. They felt guilt, and they think it is wrong now to feel any shame or any guilt for anything. Why? Because they want to believe truth is relative.
Yeah.
And so I shouldn't feel shame for things that I do. Actually, you should.
Here's a real easy question. Would your life have been better had you not sinned?
Yes.
Of course.
Every single time.
I
look at
Christian
every
orthodoxy.
sin I have ever been guilty of in my life, and without hesitation, I can tell you, if I had chosen obedience over disobedience, I would be better.
Now, we got to preach grace. But here's the thing. Most churches do. And so I'm seeing a lot of mocking of purity culture, as in, I was taught that if I sinned sexually, I was ruined forever. That message,
I was
almost
never taught that.
I mean, sorry if you were taught that.
Actually, every youth evangelist that ever came to my church was a former prostitute drug addict
Right.
who found the gospel. It
was
just
a bigger
seemed like
deal.
there were a lot of people back in the
Yeah.
80s and
Yeah.
90s that had that story. And what I mean by that, though, is that like every indoctrination that I received, and I'm fine calling it that, it was that even if you have blown it, God's grace is sufficient for your sin.
So that is an important part of that message. But what we're saying is, in as much as youth pastors and parents taught that, that was good. And if that's your definition of purity culture, you should thank your parents for teaching that.
Do not pit grace against obedience.
Yes.
Because grace is sometimes wielded, and this is not a new thing, it's wielded as an excuse for why you sin. But the Apostle Paul dealt with this in Romans 5 and 6. In Romans 5:20, he says, the law came to increase trespass, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more, so that as sin reigned in death, grace also might reign through righteousness, leading to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. And there's a stop there in our grammar. And the key is, what the Apostle Paul is saying is, no matter how big your sin gets, grace is more powerful. But then Paul, brilliant at rhetoric, Paul presupposes how someone could use that to then say, well, if grace is bigger than sin, and the more sin enters, grace, it gets even bigger. I'm going to sin, and I'm going to make grace so good. And Paul says, 6:1, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? Verse 2, by no
It's almost like the Holy Spirit knew what we would do with that and wrote it right there for us.
And that term, by no means, it's two words in the Greek, me genoito. It's the most forceful way of saying no. And Paul uses it a few times in the book of Romans, and he uses it here because then he says, how can we who died to sin still live in it? Paul doesn't pit grace against obedience. Paul looks at it and says, because God is so gracious, don't you want to obey him? Don't you want to follow him? To reject a cultural ideal of purity is to embrace a new sexual ethic. It is nothing more than trying to deconstruct the biblical sexual ethic and build a new one. And ultimately, it's sourced in a rejection of the absolutism of heterosexual monogamy. And it is a deconstruction in order to have a totally deconstructed view of sex to make sex what? Fluid. And this is where gender fluidity comes from as well. They want to say that sex is a personal issue and you are on a journey, you find your personal truth. You'll never get anywhere but chaos with that type of mindset. The relativity of truth impacts the legitimation of every ideal that would ever seek to be absolute.
Here's the other thing I love about this. Every single social study that we do shows, and this is not even a Christian virtue, although I think it points to the truth of the gospel, that the most happiness in life is found through monogamous marriage with children and grandchildren, which your youth pastor and parents were right. All right, we got to move on.
Okay.
One more quick thing. Culture warriors. We're so upset because our parents were crazy culture warriors. What were they wrong about?
As time goes by, and as much as sometimes I don't even want to admit it, but as time goes by, there's nothing that they were wrong about. You know, and so people will look at it, and it's kind of like the orange man bad mentality, where people will just look at it and say, well, some of the rhetoric was unhelpful. Yep. Only in a postmodern society would we look at something and say it's totally delegitimated because somebody woke up on the wrong side of the bed one morning and wasn't as polite as they could have been.
Right.
Where the culture war is concerned, people have to realize not only were our parents and pastors right about it, but we're in the throes of it.
Yeah.
And
this is it.
And it's foolish. And this is happening a lot in evangelical life, where people who just kind of sit with their noses in books all day and are pretty worthless, they deny that there's a culture war, but then they go on Twitter and they fight everybody. But their fight is to deny that there's a fight. And this is where it's foolish. There is a culture war. Civilization, as we know it, is being deconstructed.
Yeah.
And the only people that are going to be left at the end are the absolutists of a biblical worldview, because we're the only ones that can stand against the rise of deconstructionist tyranny. And don't give me any nonsense that post-structuralism is different than deconstructionism. They're literally synonyms where philosophy is concerned, but they both have the same ends. They're going to seek to take your children, because now we're not the kids anymore. I'm the parent now.
Yeah.
They're going to seek to take my children and have them questioning the absolutism of the scriptures, which is ultimately going to be their attempt to get them to walk away from the faith. And there's a lot of parents of 16 and 17-year-olds right now, and they're not training their children where the fundamentals of the faith are concerned, and they're not guarding their children against the false ideologies that are being spread. And the tool by which it's being spread is social media. Mm-hmm. It's TikTok. It's Instagram. And what we need to understand is that you're going to lose the Christianity of your children if you don't wake up and start doing something about it.
Culture war is on you, whether you want it or not. And so, we would love to go through every aspect of that they were right about, but I think it's enough to just say they were right about all of it.
Yeah.
I mean, did they present it in the wrong way sometimes? Of course. But that's honestly a cheap shot. That's not accurate to what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the culture war was real, is here. You better take it seriously because it wants your kids. And we'll just move on from there to say that thank you to our parents and youth pastors
Absolutely.
for that. We're not saying that every parent and youth pastor was good or right about everything. We're not saying that at all. But what we are saying is that people who love their kids and want to raise them in the Lord were right to do that, and were right about many of the things that they attempted to do, even if they stumbled in the execution, because you know what? We are too.
Yeah.
But what matters is that we take seriously Deuteronomy 6, which we talk about a lot. I'm going to read that, and then we can wrap this up. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently, and this is what our parents did, to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Look, as much as we're trying to teach our kids the absolute truth of the beauty and wonder of God, we are in the right, and we need to embrace that. And we also need to respect and acknowledge, where that was done in prior generations. And so that's really what we're here to say. Kids are not leaving the church because of pizza parties in the youth group.
Kids are leaving the church because parents aren't taking the responsibility, number one, to live out their faith that they claim they have. But then number two, because those same parents aren't taking the responsibility to educate their children.
Yep.
That's why kids leave the faith.
Yeah, it's got to happen, and we got to take it seriously. And so I think this episode is dedicated to youth pastors everywhere and to our parents.
You guys are doing a good job.
Thank you.
Keep it up. Thank you.
Yep.